I think we're ready. So, Numbers, section 2, chapters 11 through 19. So, talking about the first portion of Numbers, chapters 1 through 10, can be a little lackluster only for the sake of the fact that it looks like or feels like we're kind of recapitulating a lot of stuff we've already touched base on. But as goes the number or the books of the Torah, it's important to try to tease out and see if you can get in sync with that theological rhythm that the book is vibing to. And every book has its own subtle differences, which is surprising considering it's the same author, but a journey of 40 years, different things going on at different times, and of course just not really having any sense of where in the journey is Moses writing this piece, that piece, because presumably we all grow up with, I think, the impression that Moses just sat down and he wrote Genesis 1 through 50, all not maybe in one day, but in one sitting. He didn't work on anything else until that was done. But chances are more of this is probably a compendium of law that is eventually spread out with the narrative that glues it all together. And who knows, maybe by the time Noah or Moses was actually done with it all, that everything that comprises what we have, the Torah today, for assurance or a surety, we know that not every single statement that's in there was added by Moses. Some things are editorial comments added later for clarity or whatever else, and some of these things may have been moved around for the sake of making it flow along that theological rhythm. So, that being said, it feels like you're getting a lot of the rehashing of the law right at you again. And some of that is actually going to be kind of sprinkled into what we'll see tonight. But thankfully, the narrative picks back up again as the journey has now finally ensued. So, to remember what we talked about last week, the journey itself hasn't really even gotten started yet from the time we leave off in Exodus 40. A strange thing to think that we go through 27 chapters of Leviticus and some narrative quality events happen with respect to constructing the tabernacle, making the sacrifices necessary to install the priests, the sin of Aaron's two oldest children, and attempting to try to probably approach the Lord in a way that's not meant for them, only meant for Aaron, that necessitates the legislation that's given of this is how and when Aaron is going to come in. But outside of that, there's really not much of a narrative quality to the book. It's mostly just getting right the instructions of how God's people are going to approach him and what that's going to require. Because when we pick up in the book of Numbers, and it's not in a chronological sequence, at the beginning of the book, we are told we're in the second month of the second year, so they've only been out of Egypt for a little more than a year now. And Moses is told to count the people. But then we go several chapters later, around about chapter 9, 10-ish, and then we jump back a month, and we're back in the first month of the second year to celebrate the second Passover from them leaving Egypt. So it's important to pick up on things like that, because otherwise you get disoriented, not sure what's going on here, and you forget the fact we're following the theological rhythm. We're not following really a chronological rhythm. But the book now picks up with the narrative part of the story with respect to the idea that they actually are leaving out from Sinai and making their way up to Kadesh Barnea, which is going to become an important place for them. And we'll talk about why that is here in just a little bit. So anyway, moving on to chapter 11, and we'll read several verses from this chapter, some at the beginning up through verse 11. We'll skip verses 7 through 9, and then we'll jump down to the 30s and read from there. So anyway, Numbers 11, 1 through 6. Now the people began complaining openly before the Lord about hardship. So coming off chapter 10 with the giving of this last little bit of legislation or instruction about how to celebrate Passover if a person is ceremonially unclean during the first month when it's supposed to be celebrated, and then talking about making trumpets, and these trumpets are supposed to be used basically for giving signals for various things, military movements, calling together assemblies, or just a portion of those people or whatever. And then after that, it seems like we've covered all the bases. Everything is ready now for the journey. God has spent 27 chapters in Leviticus talking about when the tabernacle is set in place and you have the chance to express yourselves through the cultic rite of coming and shedding blood and entering into a deeper sense of intimacy of covenant relationship with God to, okay, now we're about to tear this thing down, and when we set it back up again, it might be somewhere here in the wilderness, but that's only going to be short term because we're headed for the land I promised your ancestors. And while we move, God's holiness is not to be in any way, shape, or form diminished, as goes your observance and awe of it. Certain people get to touch certain things, and it has to be touched and packaged and carried in a certain way. And if not, then remember Nadab and Abihu. They died. You will die too if you profane my holiness. And then you have to remember too, I walk amongst you. So the idea of what is clean, unclean, holy, and common or profane, there's no distinction, or I should say, there's no loss of distinction between those. And with that, if you fail to recognize that, there's going to be a problem. You're going to be inviting the unclean and the profane into the midst of this camp where I dwell, and it's going to come with severe consequences. So he's adding the extra legislation for now this is what we do when all this is packed up and you're in this military procession, filed out one tribe at a time in the fashion that I tell you to go. And when you set the tabernacle up, and this is how you camp around it, it's to prevent you from going too far in or too close to the holy place. And by virtue of that, my holiness breaches out against you. So they've got everything they need, all the instruction for setting out, and you're like, okay, so now we're ready to undertake the journey. And the first thing we get as far as an opening statement to Numbers is the people began complaining about hardship. I mean, after being sustained a full year in the desert, in Sinai, and wherever you pick geographically for the location of this mountain to be, the best candidates are just surrounded by a sea of dirt. I mean, there's nothing hospitable there as goes signs of life or really any source of sustaining nourishment as goes water or food to help even a small band or a group of people survive, much less a crowd of 1 million more. And God has superficially, or I should say supernaturally, sustained them for over a year. And yet this very source of nourishment now has become something of an inconvenience to them that they don't want anymore. So anyway, begin to complain about hardship. Back to verse 2. Verse 1. When the Lord heard, his anger burned, and fire from the Lord blazed out among them and consumed the outskirts of the camp. Which is interesting because the question would then be, what is the source of this fire? But we don't have time to explore that. Then the people cried out to Moses, and he prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. So that place was named Taberah because the Lord's fire had blazed out among them. The riffraff among them had a strong craving for other food. So the word in the CSB, riffraff, or other translations may say mixed multitude, but the Hebrew word is meant to be more or less a derogatory term. It is a rabble of people. And so riffraff is not necessarily a literal translation of it, but the idea is that it's not necessarily the people of Israel, not to say they're not included amongst this, but it's to draw attention to the people who are not native to them that are probably the instigators of this moment of griping and complaining. So the riffraff, they have a strong craving for other food, and the Israelites wept again and said, "Who will feed us meat? We remember the free fish we ate in Egypt, along with the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic, but now our appetite is gone." And we'll see there's more to that word here in just a second as goes, our appetite is, quote, gone, end quote. There's nothing to look at but this manna. Moses heard the people, family after family, weeping at the entrance of their tents. The Lord was very angry, and Moses was also provoked. So Moses asked the Lord, "Why have you brought such trouble on your servant? And why are you angry with me? Why do you burden me with these people?" Now, down to verse 31. A wind, swept by the Lord, came up, blew quail in from the sea, and it dropped all around them in the camp. They were flying 3 feet off the ground for about a day's journey in every direction. You can only imagine how much quail that must have been. The people were up all that day and night and all the next day gathering the quail. The one who took the least gathered 60 bushels. They spread them out all around the camp. And while the meat was still between their teeth before it was chewed, the Lord's anger burned against the people. And the Lord struck them with a very severe plague. So they named that place Kibroth-Hattaavah because they were, hey, what's up, dude? Because they buried the people who had craved the meat. So from Kibroth-Hattaavah, the people moved to Hazeroth, and they remained there. Now I'm going to redress verses 24 through 30 here in just a second. Before I do, let's talk a little bit about what's going on here at the top of the screen. So what this is supposed to help us see is, as we look through the lens of the Genesis prologue, this entire sequence from Genesis 1 through 3, and even elements, slight subtle hints of the flavors of chapter 4 are also kind of baked into this as well. What I mean is here we have in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, the people have been placed in the garden, and now God gives them trees for food. They can take of anything they want except for one tree. They are free to eat at will. There's no restrictions on them for how much they can take and when. Again, the only thing that is there restriction-wise is just which particular tree they cannot have. And if we got a good understanding of what Genesis 1 and 2 are all about and what the source of the tree that they're forbidden from partaking of is really representing, which is wisdom, both trees in the garden, whether we're talking life or good and bad or evil, both of them are sources of wisdom. And it's important for us also to understand the Bible clears this up as it goes on, especially when we get to 1 Kings 5. 1 Kings 5, we've got Solomon. It's either 3 or 5. Sometimes I get confused. But we've got Solomon and Gibeah. And while he's there, he is there to sacrifice to the Lord. He's just newly been coronated as king, and God shows up in a dream. And when he does, he asks, "What can I give you?" And he recognizes, look, I'm just a small child. He's a grown man. He's wearing the crown of his father now. He's been anointed king over all of Israel. He's not a small child. He's, again, an adult and has full mental wherewithal and total capacity to make decisions for himself. But he humbles himself before the Lord and says, I'm really an ignorant child, and I need from you a wise, discerning heart that will help me distinguish between what is right and wrong at the level your people need if I'm responsible for administering justice and leading this people like a shepherd leads sheep. So he can choose to rule how he wants to, which would be wisdom in his own eyes, or he can choose to rule by the wisdom that God would give, but he recognizes that only God gives that, and there's no way to get that apart from him. So he asks God to give the one thing that he cannot attain to himself. But God's pleased with this. But again, it's the right or ability to discern between good and evil. That is exactly what this tree in the garden is supposed to presume or subsume to give, is the knowledge of good and evil. It's not that God wanted to keep the humans in the garden ignorant, by no means. It's just that he simply wanted them to trust in him, that he would define for them what is right and wrong, in time give them this wisdom, and they would not choose to try to take it for themselves, divorced or apart from him. Understand? So the trees themselves represent wisdom, and it's the understanding that taking from that tree without God is attempting to try to follow what is wise in your own eyes by virtue of the lust of your own heart. So it's, in essence, Yahweh's wisdom versus restricted wisdom. Now let's use that as a lens to look at what's going on here and see if we can make better sense as goes why God got so angry. Because remember, there's a few things that are working here in the background in this story when we talk about the nation of Israel. Israel is basically, in a corporate sense, a new Adam. And because they are a new Adam, it puts them back in the context of that garden story, which raises the propensity then for them to make the same mistake that Adam did or to choose rightly. But neither of them are a one-and-done choice. Every moment of every day, it's always staring down the barrel of choosing what is right and what pleases God, or choosing what is right in your own eyes and following the corruptness of your own heart. Hopefully that will make more sense as we go on. Because they have given to them the manna every single day. It's the bread that God has given. And obviously it doesn't taste bland, because the description that the author gives us of what this tasted like was basically a sweet pastry. And they're given it every single day, and they can take as much as they want. They're not rationing this stuff out. And the only thing it really comes with is just the guidelines on when to gather it, as goes the Sabbath. You're not supposed to gather more than you need, because if you do and you don't eat it all, you hold it till the next day, it's going to turn into worms. And you're supposed to gather twice as much on Friday, because on the Sabbath day, you're not going to have any to go out there and collect. They've learned this lesson already the hard way. Now, when you talk about the idea of the food of Egypt, again, going back to this story, with respect to the tree of life and the knowledge of good and evil, looking at it from the perspective of Solomon's request, please give me a knowledge or a discerning heart to tell the difference between good and bad, and God is pleased with that, then there's nothing inherently wrong with the tree of the knowledge of good and bad or evil. It's not a tree that's meant to be seen as rotten apples with worms just coming out of them or anything like that. And certainly, as we know it's pleasing to the eyes, there's nothing inherently wrong with taking of the fruit itself if God invited them to do that in time. We never get that far in the story because as soon as the tempter comes along, they choose to follow him. So, having said that, when we look at what they're describing here, the food of Egypt versus the food that God gives, such as meat, free fish, and meat at will. Obviously, there's some exaggeration going on here as far as whether or not it's free and they can just take it whenever they want. But they also describe veggies, melons. I mean, a full balanced diet that they seem to have missed. Remember, it's the riffraff, the mixed multitude, the people who saw the work of Yahweh in Egypt and chose to be a part of Israel in leaving the decimated land of Egypt behind and join themselves to these people. There's nothing wrong with that food. However, it's the food of Egypt. Now, what is Egypt in this story? We've learned this already in the past. When we go back to the story of Joseph in Genesis 37, we are given seeds of this theme that will start to fruesce and blossom as the story of Joseph moves on into the whole Exodus narrative itself. When we go back to chapter 37, we are told in the moment of the movement when Joseph's brothers decide to sell him because they see this wandering caravan come along, Moses chooses to give us the detail of what those traders, not traitors, traders, were peddling and carrying down to Egypt to sell. And some of the things that they had with them were gum, balsam, resin, myrrh. All of these are the necessary ingredients for making embalming fluid. We go down a little bit further in the story, and when the information comes back to Jacob that his son apparently is dead, as the boys concoct the ruse of, hey, he got torn apart by a wild animal. See, here's his cloak covered in his blood. Then, of course, he rips his garments. He dishevels his hair. They try to comfort him in the days that ensue afterwards, but he continues to insist he will not be comforted and says he will go down to Sheol. Sheol is the grave, the Hebrew realm of the dead. He's going to go down, descend. But after that moment in the story, we are told that Joseph is literally on his way down into Egypt. So using the visual narrative or cue in the narrative of how Joseph is descending and where Jacob says he is going to go to meet with his son because he thinks his son is dead in the realm of the dead or Sheol, Egypt symbolically in the story becomes the realm of the dead. It is the land where death reigns. It is the land where the civilization itself has become basically an expert death cult because everything that you do in life is geared toward your place in the afterlife and so forth. So anyway, considering that, when these people start yearning for the food of that land, then what are they choosing? Are they choosing the food that brings life and sustainment out in the wilderness that God brings from heaven? Or the food that anybody else in the world can eat, and there's nothing wrong with eating that food, but it's the fact it comes from Egypt. It's the fact that it's a vestige tied to that place, and it's a yearning to want to go back to that land. Going back to this story here in Genesis chapters 1 through 3, remember when Eve offers her husband the fruit, he partakes, he eats. When God speaks to the man, he says, because you shema, or listened and obeyed the voice of your wife, this calamity has now come upon you. You're going to be kicked out of the garden, exile. Who are they listening to in this story? It wasn't the Israelites who began this. This wave of complaint came from those people who were native to Egypt or lands around the area, were in Egypt at the time the Exodus began. chose to leave and go with Israel, and now they're expressing their disdain for what God is sustaining them with. The quail that God gave originally in the beginning seems to have dissipated, and now every day it's just the manna. Not to say they don't have sources of meat. They can slaughter their livestock if they want to. They've got poultry. They can certainly eat from the eggs. Goats, they've got milk. There are other things to have beside the manna, not to mention all the ways that a person can prepare the manna. But it's just the idea. These people are expressing a longing for what their stomachs had been adept to all along, wanting to go back to that. And Moses gives us the clue in the story that it starts to spread family by family until virtually all families are standing at the entrance to their tents, and they're all moaning and groaning, and they are sick to death of this food that God gives. And notice what is said there. It says our appetite is gone. In Hebrew, it's way more serious than that, because in Hebrew, what is actually being said is our nefesh. Our nefesh is a soul or a being, and it is yabesh, which means basically it's wasting away, like the way a grape transitions over to a raisin, becoming completely dehydrated, shriveled up to where it's hardly more than a husk of what it was before. So that's the idea. This bread, so get this, if you're thinking this out in your mind, the bread that God gives from heaven is causing in their minds a complete wasting away of their very life's being and essence, which is what the food of Egypt really should be doing. The craving that they have in their mind and the vanity that that's attached to should be that very thing, wasting them away, but they've inverted it in their minds. And this is why this is important, because what we're being set up for here is a paradigm that's going to echo through the rest of the Torah and well beyond that into the writings of the prophets. That Israel has been redeemed from Egypt, and Egypt has been decimated. But they will continue to long for Egypt in such a way that eventually, little by little, systematically, Israel starts to change their own sense of self and identity in such a way that now Egypt is become Israel. Or perhaps a more accurate way of saying it is that Israel has become the new Egypt. I can't think of a better place of pointing this out other than in the books of Samuel, because if you consider the request or demand of the people, give us a king now. And then Samuel says, if you take on a king, this is what the king will do. He is going to take your sons, he's going to take your vineyards, he is going to take your orchards, he's going to take the best of all of your fields they have to produce, he's going to take your servants, both male and female. When you hear all of this, he's going to take, and you really can't do anything about that, then the king then is really nothing more than a what? A tyrant who can take whatever he wants. Considering the stories that have showed up in the Bible from Genesis all the way up to the beginning of Samuel, when Saul becomes king and Samuel gives that warning of this is what the king will do, what other person in a kingly role have you seen in any of those stories who acted in this tyrannical way and just took? It's right there at the beginning of the book of Exodus, because we move away from the Pharaoh that was the Pharaoh during the time of Joseph, who opened the land to his people and said, come, you can have the best, to the Pharaoh who doesn't know Joseph, and he takes Joseph's people, and what does he do with them? He turns them into slaves. Basically, that's what Samuel is saying the king will do. He will turn all of you into his servants. In fact, he says that. All of you will become his servants. He is saying the king that is appointed over you is going to act like the Pharaoh of Egypt at the time of the oppression of our ancestors. And you'll see that echoed more and more and more through the life of Saul with the way that he behaves and acts like a king when he murders a whole family of priests, when he is pursuing God's chosen out into the wilderness to attempt to try to take his life, like Pharaoh did to the brink of the Red Sea. I mean, just so many hints that show that. And this is the seedbed from where this kind of thing comes from. But thankfully, the story doesn't end quite there. Moses bellyaches and complains in the mid-portion of this, and God graciously answers. But what we do see here is that there is something of a lack of the prophetic voice, not because Moses is not exercising that role, but he deems it as being too much for him to handle by himself. Adam was not exercising a prophetic role in the garden narrative. He's right there beside his wife. He's hearing the tempter. He sees his wife's actions. He doesn't stop her from sinking her teeth into the fruit. He doesn't call into question what the serpent has said. He doesn't try to talk that down and saying, that may be true, but we are going to check that by what the Lord has said, and we will inquire of him. We will ask him what he has to say about your truth claim. Instead, he just opts for, give me the fruit if I can have this wisdom on my own. This is what's going on here. The people are succumbing to their lustful appetite, and they're not listening to Moses. So what God does is he takes from the Spirit given to Moses, and he divvies it up to 70 other men who are going to share this burden, not at equal status to Moses, but they will be there to help instill a sense of discernment amongst the people when grumbling like this comes up. That they can work amongst the people to say, no, remember, hear, O Israel, and various things to that extent, right? So with that comes life and wisdom, and that's what we need to take away from that. When the Lord divvies out the Spirit amongst his people, life and wisdom are meant to ensue as the byproduct. All right, so then we go on to chapter 12, and now a pattern starts to develop here. We've already seen it, but let me illustrate it a little further, because once we get from chapter 10 all the way through 12, what we're going to see is basically a wave-like effect here where we have a high point and then a 2-chapter dive, and 1 chapter going in and 1 chapter kind of coming out to lead us to another high point, and we're going to have 3 whole cycles of this before we get out of that, and then they're finally there, cursed now to wander around in the wilderness for the next 40 years, which leads us to the back half of the book. So anyway, the people began to grumble. We'll start in verse 1 of chapter 12. Miriam and Aaron criticized Moses because of the Cushite woman he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. And we're to understand this woman is probably of Ethiopian, Nubian descent, so black of skin, obviously not Zipporah. While there are some theologians out there and scholars over the years who have stated that it's possible Zipporah could still be the reference point here, that it was always understood that she was black of skin. Chances are that's not the case if she was truly Midianite. Anyway, they said, does the Lord only speak through Moses? Does he not also speak through us? I'll just be candid here. For years and years and years as a child, on up through my earlier teenage years and whatnot, when I read this passage, it just kind of baffled me, because we're told in the first verse that they seem to want to pick an argument with Moses because of his wife. But when they open their mouths and speak, the question then is, does the Lord just speak through you, or does he not also speak through us? What does that have to do with the woman he married? But we're going to perhaps learn something about that here in a second. So anyway, the Lord hears it. On to verse 3. Moses was a very humble man, more so than anyone on the face of the earth. That's probably one of those statements for sure that was edited in later on. Moses didn't write that about himself. Verse 4, suddenly the Lord said to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, you 3 come out to the tent of meeting. So the 3 joined him when they went out. And the Lord descended in a pillar of cloud, stood at the entrance to the tent, summoned Aaron and Miriam. And when the 2 of them came forward, he said, listen to what I say. If there is a prophet among you from the Lord, I make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my household, and I speak with him directly, openly, and not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord, meaning there is no one else like Moses. And we know at the end of Moses' story arc, there won't be for generations to come. So why were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? The Lord's anger burned against him, and he left. As the cloud moved away from the tent, Miriam's skin suddenly became diseased, resembling snow. When Aaron turned toward her, he saw that she was diseased and said to Moses, my Lord, please don't hold this against us, that we have sinned. We have acted so foolishly. Please don't let her be like a dead baby whose flesh is half eaten away when he comes out of his mother's womb. So Moses cries out to the Lord, God, please heal her. The Lord answered Moses, if her father had merely spit in her face, wouldn't she remain in disgrace for 7 days? Let her be confined outside the camp for 7 days, and after that she may be brought back in. So Miriam was confined outside the camp for 7 days. The people did not move on until Miriam was brought back in, and after that the people set out from Hazeroth and camped in the wilderness of Paran. So there's a lot of sketchy things going on here as far as stuff that we probably won't understand on first reading, and that's totally fine. Case in point, why is Miriam the only one that is cursed here? as opposed to Aaron. It's easy to see how this might be a bit of a chauvinistic move on God's part to only want to punish the woman but leave the man totally out of this. Then there's also the question, why 7 days if God could just totally heal her? We've got that moment when Moses was shown the sign himself, when he asked God, how will these people know? What if they don't believe that when I say you sent me? Okay, well then you take your rod, you throw it on the ground. Guess what will happen? It becomes a snake. Here's the second sign. Put your hand into your cloak. Pull it out. Oh, it's leprous. Put it back in. Instantaneously, it's made whole again. Why does she have to go outside the camp for 7 days? And even worse, perhaps, this enigmatic statement of father spitting in the face of a daughter. I mean, who does that? So it's a lot of weird things here. So as we try to work through it, maybe make some sense of it, I think what we'll kind of appreciate here is that as the people grumble and Moses cries out himself the way that he does, God divvies out the Spirit upon Moses to 70 people. Who witnessed this? We move on to chapter 12. Aaron and Miriam. Okay, what they say is not untrue in any way, shape, or form. Up until this moment, when Moses went into Egypt because of his incessant back and forth with God of I cannot or I will not go, when he says, I am weak of tongue, what does God say he will do to supplement or augment Moses' efforts in front of Pharaoh? He sends him Aaron, who is the one who begins to speak first in front of Pharaoh and the people. Aaron has carried with him as a mouthpiece the word of the Lord. Who is the one who by the seaside, after Moses leads everyone in the victory psalm, when the Egyptians are washing up dead at their feet, also takes to leading them in the last bit of that song, last verse, if you will, of that song, and is accorded as a prophetess, his sister Miriam. So both of these people have enjoyed being able to openly speak prophetically, not necessarily telling anything futuristic, but just boldly proclaiming the word of the Lord. So Moses is complaining as if he's been doing this all by himself. Nobody's been there to help him. One could see that perhaps as being a little questionable in their eyes. Dude, we've been here the whole time, helping you. But that, of course, is not meant to justify their complaint, which they bring out in something of a cowardly way by, in some probably derogatory way, wanting to pick a fight with Moses about his Cushite wife. And then once we get past the veil or the facade as to what the real matter is, it bubbles up to the top. Does the Lord just speak through you? What about us also? So anyway, now all these elders prophesy. And what we have after that, back in chapter 11, is when the 70 elders are identified, it seems like 68 of them come up before Moses at the tent of meeting. 2 of these men have stayed behind in the tents. The Spirit moves from Moses to them, and in one spontaneous but isolated moment of extemporaneous speech, they all prophesy. What they said, don't know, doesn't matter. They don't do it again for the rest of their lives. It was to signify, though, the Spirit is truly, tangibly there. Moses can know the deal is done. 2 of those men are still in the tents, and they, at the moment the other 68 are talking, stand up and they prophesy. Joshua hears this. He comes running to Moses. The people in the camp are prophesying. Stop them. But Moses says, are you jealous on my account? If only it was God's will that all of his people were prophets. If only they could all tap into the Spirit and know what I know, then we probably wouldn't have these issues of the grumbling and complaining and dragging petulant children to a place they don't want to go, kicking and screaming, because they would know what awaits them there. But then you can imagine it's kind of like Moses and Aaron and Miriam saying, wait a minute, say what? Why are they getting this gift? And then they look to Moses and they say, does the Lord not speak through us already? Why the need for you to ask for help and God give 70 more people? By virtue of the fact that Miriam is the one who was struck with leprosy, it would seem to follow on that she perhaps was the one who instigated this. And by virtue of her instigating and dragging Miriam along, or Aaron along, sorry, I keep getting the names mixed up, dragging Aaron along, this falls in line with the sequence of patterns that we've already seen and we will see follow on after this. When we get up to them defying God and not wanting to go into the land by virtue of the word of the 10 spies. The rest of the people get 40 years in the wilderness. What happens to the 10 spies who brought that report? God killed them immediately. So they got a more severe punishment because of what they said, what they did, and how it influenced others. And they still experience the circumstance of God's judgment. We don't really know how Aaron might have experienced God's judgment in this, but Miriam by virtue of the skin disease. Again, why leprosy? Well, I've kind of already alluded to it. Remember that when Moses asked, how will the people know? What if they don't believe when I say you sent me? What sign will I do? Rod, snake. If that's not enough, here's another. Hand in cloak, leprosy. Hand back in cloak, no leprosy. What in essence is Miriam really getting at here when she is contending with Moses over the idea of who speaks for the Lord? Time has passed from the moment Moses was speaking to the Lord at the burning bush to this very moment where they're standing there. And God has certainly solidified in full view of the public that Moses is his man. Moses is the one that God called, nobody else. Moses is the one that has been serving basically as the face and voice of God through all of this. He has been exercising God's power in an almost unrestrained way at the Lord's discretion whenever God chooses to use him as an instrument before the people. And now when she steps up and asks, or maybe in a pseudo way kind of makes the statement, God speaks through us too, it's detracting away from the position that Moses has, which is not meant to undercut him and thereby Moses acts in a vengeful way. God vindicates his servant. He does this because of Miriam's unbelief by striking her flesh with leprosy. Now, why the 7 days outside the camp? The law has already been given way back in Leviticus. Anybody has an issue of a skin disease, that was reiterated in the midpoint of where we were last week. They have to be outside the camp for 7 days. Why? Because it's the cosmic mountain of God concept. Here's God's temple. Here's his presence. You have to be in a state of wholeness to be here. To be anything less than is to be further away from God in a ritual sense, but it's trending toward death. Notice the way that Aaron describes this. Please don't let her flesh appear like that of a newborn baby that's eaten half away, a stillborn child. That's death, obviously. Don't let her appear that way. And so she's got to be isolated for 7 days. And of course, the Lord is going to take care of this. Why the statement about spitting in her face, as if to say a father would do such an undignified, uncouth thing? If in the part of the world where it's all honor-shame society, if a daughter did something so egregious to shame her father and thereby family, and the father wanted to make sure she understood just how bad this was, spitting in anybody's face in front of the full view of the public is going to be something to sorely denigrate them in the minds of everybody else. Nobody's going to forget this. So it's going to be a huge act of shame brought on the person who was on the receiving end of the spittle coming from his mouth. He is just simply calling into question a cultural practice and using that as an example by saying, if a father spit in his daughter's face to shame her in front of everyone else, then would she not be also isolated, in a certain way? Would she not remain in disgrace for 7 days? So she is now to carry her disgrace outside the camp, and her being outside the camp and us not able to move on is to let everybody know, hey, it's Miriam's fault, and she's wearing the guilt on her skin, literally. So, any questions about that? Does that kind of make a little better sense as to what's going on there? All right. Now, Numbers 13. We'll read verses 1 through 3 and jump down to 17. So the Lord spoke to Moses, send men out to scout the land of Canaan I'm giving to the Israelites. Send one man who is a leader among them from every one of their ancestral tribes. So Moses sent them from the wilderness of Paran at the Lord's command. All the men were leaders in Israel. When Moses sent them to scout out the land of Canaan, he told them, go up this way to the Negev, then go up to the hill country, see what the land is like, whether the people who live there are strong or weak, whether there are many, and is the land they live in good or bad? Are the cities they live in encampments or fortifications? Is the land fertile or unproductive? Are there trees in it or not? Be courageous. Bring back some fruit from the land. So down in verse 26, the men went back to Moses, Aaron, and the entire Israelite community in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back a report from the whole community, for the whole community, and they followed, and then they showed them some fruit of the land. They reported to Moses, we went into the land where you sent us. Indeed, it is flowing with milk and honey, and here is some of its fruit. However, the people living in the land are strong, The cities are large and fortified. We also saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites are living in the land of the Negev. The Hethites, Jebusites, Amorites live in the hill country. The Canaanites by the sea and along the Jordan. Then Caleb quieted the people in the presence of Moses and said, "Let's go up now and take possession of the land, because we can certainly conquer it." But the men who had gone up with him responded, "We can't attack the people because they're stronger than we are." So they gave a negative report to the Israelites about the land they had scouted. "The land we passed through to explore is one that devours its inhabitants, and all the people we saw enter are men of great size. We even saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. To ourselves we seem like grasshoppers, and we must have seemed even more so to them." So this is interesting, because here we have this moment of grumbling and complaining that, kind of crescendos now with them getting out of this debacle with Miriam to now go to the land. They're at Kadesh, and from Kadesh they're going to launch out and have the chance to see the land before they go in to conquer it. But we know from the structuring of these materials and the rebellions that are listed for us, there's a total of 7 rebellions in the mid portion of the book of Numbers. There's no coincidence as to why 7 are enumerated. Over 40 years, there probably have been many more instances, but these are strategically chosen for the sake of what was shown through each of them. With first Moses grumbling, then Miriam and Aaron complaining, and then they rebel against Moses. And now we're getting ready to go into a 2-chapter narrative where the entire community of Israel just blatantly rejects the whole idea of the Exodus. What is the idea of the Exodus? You're going from Egypt, the land of the dead, up here to Canaan, the land that God has promised your ancestors, that's going to be the new provincial Eden space, a land described as flowing with milk and honey, a new creation for you that you're going to launch out from here like a vine on a trellis and impact the world per the promise I made to Abram. So when they reject that, they want to go back to the land of the dead. Makes absolutely no sense. But anyway, there's a bit of a tension here. It hasn't quite developed, but I'm going to steal from Deuteronomy to create the tension for us, because if we don't see it now, we'll definitely see it then. And so it kind of helps us understand a little better going on, or as it's going on right now, what's happening here. So in the orange box on the screen, I'm going to read, I've already read what's in the purple box. I'm going to read what is given here in Deuteronomy chapter 1. This is Moses recounting this event 40 years later. "When we reached Kadesh Barnea, I said to you, 'We have reached the hill country of the Amorites, which the Lord our God is giving us. See, the Lord your God has set the land before you. Go up, take possession of it, as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has told you. Do not be afraid or discouraged.'" Then Moses goes on to tell them, as he's sermonizing this in Deuteronomy, "I said that, and after I said, 'Go take charge of it,' you came to me and you said, 'Well, hold on a second. How about we send some men into the land to spy out the land? Have them tell us what the cities and the road structures and all look like, and maybe even bring back some fruit from the land.' Hence the instructions that are given by the Lord, and then Moses, to send men, one from every tribe, to go in, spy out the land, and bring back produce." So which one was it? The first one given to us in real space and time in Numbers is God telling Moses, "Send one man from each tribe, go spy out the land." When Moses recounts this 40 years later in Deuteronomy, he says he was the one that told them to go. Can you see the tension there between them? It almost sounds like a complete contradiction, because we've got 2 different voices giving command. But I think it's both. And why we're supposed to understand it as both is because from the Deuteronomy perspective, when they approach Moses with this idea, what they are wanting is proof that the land is a land flowing with milk and honey. Now, who is the one that's claimed it's a land flowing with milk and honey? Exactly. So that calls into question what he has said, but not in a derogatory or defamatory way. God acquiesces to this. We'll see that in a second. And they want a strategy, because when you're asking, hey, where are the towns and what do they look like? Back to the Numbers text. Are they encampments or fortified cities? What's the road systems look like? How can we travel? We need all of this information because we want to craft what before we go to the land? Strategy. We want a battle plan. So God acquiesces to this. It's not an unwise or an unsound thing to want to do that. So God allows them to see with their own eyes. They can only hear with their ears about what the cities look like. The report of the spies gives that. Large, fortified, strong people. Don't say anything about roadways, but nonetheless. Then 2 men are carrying strapped to a pole, what? A great big cluster of, grapes. Big cluster of grapes. Here is your proof. You can see this with your own eyes. Truly a land filled with abundance. And they give the only positive comment they make, a retort toward that to say, yes, absolutely. So they bring grapes, figs, pomegranates, and it vindicates Yahweh is telling the truth. But when they speak about how the land is filled with strong people, fortified cities, giants, the descendants of Anak, obviously what it's calling into question here now is how are we going to conquer them? They're going to have to do this only with God's strength. Either way, whether it's a land flowing with milk and honey or whether it's a land filled with formidable foes, the only person who is going to make this possible is the Lord. They're going to have to trust. That takes us back to the Garden of Eden. It seems like every one of these stories is filled with the garden narrative, but that's why. Because here they're left with 2 choices, 2 different trees. There's the tree of God's wisdom, which is a land flowing with milk and honey that lies right before us. It's ours for the taking, but we have these obstacles that are not going to be easy to overcome. But He has said He will deliver them to us. He will take their favorable status away from them. He will go before us into battle. We have to trust, which they've already seen evidence of that when they fought the Amalekites out in the wilderness. Did they not? And then we've got what seems better in our own eyes, which is how stupid is it for us to go against these people we stand no chance of conquering. And it's not a small thing either to pull from history and know that during the time period that the conquest would have happened, Egypt also would have had very strong oversight over Canaan. Many historians and archaeologists claim that most of, at least the southern half of the land of Canaan, everybody that ruled over a city that was called a kingdom, what we would call basically nothing more than a nation state, were either really nothing more there than governors, maybe called kings, but governors in the sense that they were vassal rulers put there by their Egyptian overlords and ruled as long as they complied with Egypt's policies. So, if any of these Canaanites had somebody infiltrating the land that was kicking butt and taking names, and it's going to be hard for them to overcome that challenge, who's big brother that they get to call back on and say, we need help? Exactly. And Pharaoh has outposts stretched out all through the east, out into that area where they've got military encampments, guarding turquoise mines and all kinds of stuff. But who just got their tail whipped? Who did they just leave? Egypt. They just left Egypt. Is Egypt in any shape to fight a battle? No. And probably by this point, Canaanites might have even begun to hear that information, which we'll go on to here in just a second. So, I put that right there on the slide, man. You read my mind. So in Numbers 14, we get the back half of this judgment story here, which of course ends really bad. So the first 10 verses. Then the whole community broke into loud cries. The people wept that night. All the Israelites complained about Moses and Aaron. The whole community told them, if only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if we had died in the wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us up to this land, bringing us into this land to die by the sword? Our wives and children will become plunder. Wouldn't it have been better for us to go back to Egypt? So they say to one another, let's appoint a new leader, go back to Egypt. And when Moses and Aaron fell down on their face in front of the whole assembly of the Israelite community, Joshua, son of Nun, Caleb, son of Jephunneh, who were among those who scouted out the land, tore their clothes and said to the entire Israelite community, the land we passed through and explored is an extremely good land. If the Lord is pleased with us, He will bring us into this land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and give it to us. Only don't rebel against the Lord. Don't be afraid of the people of the land, for we will devour them. And their protection has been removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Don't be afraid. While the whole community threatened to stone them, the glory of the Lord appeared to all the Israelites in front of the tent of meeting. So verses 13 through 19. But Moses replied, when the Lord wants to annihilate them all, the Egyptians will hear about it, for by your strength you brought up this people from them. They'll tell it to the inhabitants of the land. They have heard that you, Lord, are among these people, how you, Lord, are seen face to face, how your cloud stands over them, how you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. If you kill this people with a single blow, the nations that have heard of your fame will declare, since the Lord wasn't able to bring this people into the land He swore to give them, He has slaughtered them in the wilderness. So now, may my Lord's power be magnified, just as you have spoken. The Lord is slow to anger, abounding in faithful love, forgiving iniquity and rebellion. Alluding back to Exodus 32 through 34, when God dealt with the golden calf rebellion. But he will not leave the guilty unpunished, bringing the consequences of the father's iniquity on the children to the third and fourth generation. So please pardon the iniquity of this people in keeping with the greatness of your faithful love, just as you have forgiven them from Egypt up until now. So God does. He says, I have pardoned them as you have requested, down in verse 30. I swear that none of you will enter the land I promised to settle you in, except Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun. I will bring your children whom you said would become plunder into the land you rejected, and they will enjoy it. But as for you, your corpses will fall in the wilderness. Your children will be shepherds in the wilderness for 40 years and bear the penalty of your acts of unfaithfulness until all your corpses lie scattered in the wilderness. You will bear the consequences of your iniquities 40 years based on the number of the 40 days that you scouted the land, a year for each day. So, in asking the question from God's part to Moses, how long will they not trust in me? I think there's some important things for us to notice here. We didn't go over this when we read the verses earlier, but if anybody is reading the chapter, one thing hopefully that I've taught you along the way is that anytime we are given subtle details that seem like just throwaway information for us, usually it's not. When you go back to examine the report of the, let me rephrase that. When you go back and you examine the breakdown of where they went to and what they explored in the land, the only city that's really given any information about as to where they stopped was Hebron. This is vastly important because Hebron is the very place where Abram stopped to call upon the name of the Lord and build an altar to him, not before, but after he left Egypt. So Exodus 12, he gets into the land, he sees there's a famine. He builds an altar to the Lord at Shechem first, but he sees there's famine in the land. He goes to Egypt. Bad things happen there. In a sense, it's a miniaturized version of the exile because there's plagues and God's people get to leave out of Egypt way richer than they were. But, of course, Abram also has to live somewhat with the guilt of the fact that he was deceptive in manipulating Pharaoh the way that he did. That being said, when he leaves the land, he then winds up in Hebron, and when he gets there, he calls upon the name of the Lord, builds an altar. And then eventually, when Abram's life story is over with, Sarah has died already, and by the time Abram goes to be laid to rest with her, this is the only parcel of ground that they own that they actually get to pass on to Isaac. It is the sustained legacy that goes from generation to generation until they now cross over the River Jordan and come into the land. This is all that they have is right here in Hebron. And it's not just Abram and Sarah. It's Abram and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, even Jacob and Leah. Not Rachel, she got buried somewhere else. 3 whole generations of family are buried on the family plot here in Hebron. Would you think it's a coincidence then that the one place that's mentioned that they went to go see is the place that they actually have legal claim to and is a monument, a true test to intergenerational faith stretching centuries back? If anything, this should be screaming, this is our flag in the ground that says God is going to give us this land. We've already got a foothold here. But instead, they see Hebron as the place where the sons of Anak reside, because it is. 40 years later, Caleb is going to be the one who demands of Joshua, look, dude, we've already went up and down this land, and we have been tearing it up, and we have been putting everybody on the run. God has already kind of given you instruction to kind of start disbanding the whole army and send the tribes out to finish the job in all of the places where they're going to settle. I tell you what I want. I want that mountain. Guess where that mountain is? It's in Hebron. I want it. The sons of Anak are still there. Guess who wants to go and just annihilate them? Caleb. So if they have settled in Hebron and are still there 40 years later, obviously they were there 40 years earlier, this is who they see living in this space where they have foothold in the land. And for them, it's terrifying. The flag in the ground is not enough to sway them that God is going to hand them the victory. So the faith of Abraham displayed at Hebron and the Eden-like conditions. Because here's the thing. When they go to the valley of Eshcol to get the grapes they carry back with them, guess where Eshcol is? It's just north of this. Do you know what its former name used to be? Because it gets named Eshcol once they pluck the grapes from it. Its former name was Mamre. Guess who was sitting there when God comes and tells this guy he's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah? Abram. So here you've got this Eden-like paradise where clusters of grapes are so big it takes 2 dudes to carry it. Not too far from Hebron. They had to go there to see it, to get the grapes. They've seen the conditions. They know Eden waits on the other side of the southern boundary of the land. But again, it's not enough. Their measure of faith is really like that of Cain. Now, granted, it's a little different because they haven't offered anything. They haven't been rejected by the Lord. But remember, in that story, God says, if you do what is right, you will be accepted. You have the chance here. You have the choice to make. And if you do what's right, then favor is waiting for you. They have the choice to make. But when they hear the report of the spies, what do they want to do? They want to stone Moses. They want to stone Joshua and Caleb for trying to incite faith amongst the people rather than rebellion. Their murderous rage is very Cain-like in essence. And what does Cain get by virtue of his act of rebellion that led to murder? Exile. What are these people getting? Now, when Moses points out, hey, the Egyptians are going to hear about this, it's not to point out God's vanity. Obviously, God doesn't have any, but it's the simple fact, the idea that Egyptians kind of ruling over the Canaanites, the Egyptians have seen firsthand what God has done. The Canaanites are about to experience that too. But God is not necessarily wanting to be known just as the guy who wants to kick everybody's butt and kick them out of their land. God has spoken through Abram that he's going to bring what to the nations? What to every family of the earth? Blessing. And not just, hey, I'm God and I want to smile on you. He wants to bring Eden blessing to every one of these nations. Does Egypt count as a nation? Does Canaan and their peoples count as nations? Yes. Rahab, we saw in Joshua, she is a Canaanite. She receives the Lord's blessing. Others will as well. But this has to happen first before that project or phase of that project can begin or ensue, where Eden blessing begins to flow to all of the nations. And so what really we're left with here is if Israel elects to go back to Egypt, the land of the dead, when God is seeking to utilize them as a new creation, if it's through them that Eden blessing and hope is going to flow to the nations, but they never get to the land, they never settle it, what happens to the idea of hope for the nations? It's gone. It's gone. There is no hope for the nations. God, from the opening pages of Scripture, chooses to rule with human beings. God chooses to exercise his authority through human beings. God chooses human image bearers to be the conduits that his blessing is going to flow to the nations. So that plan is going to include them, or there is no plan. It's just that simple. So we have to understand here that that's part of the reason why Moses is invoking that, is to say, Egypt will hear, others will as well. Hope is going to be gone if you just annihilate them all. But notice too, Moses' words. Moses is not trying to just simply beg the Lord that he'll overlook this. When he asks that he pardon them, it's to forego annihilating them. But when he recites what the Lord said about his own identity from Exodus, that he is slow to anger, he is sure to forgive iniquity and rebellion, but he will also hold guilty those who sin against him, even up to the 4th generation. Moses is not asking for the consequence of the sin to be wiped away. Moses is not asking that they be held guiltless. Moses is full on anticipating there are going to be consequences, just like with the rebellion with the golden calf. God doesn't kill everybody like he told Moses he wanted to on the mount, but do people die when that rebellion happens? Absolutely. So consequence will ensue. He expects exile. He expects judgment. He expects death. And we know as this chapter wraps up, that's exactly what happens. Now this is interesting because once we get past this and we get into Numbers 15, we start getting more Torah. And this becomes an expansion of this pattern where we have rebellion and then we get more Torah. We'll get rebellion and then we'll get more Torah. And then we'll get some more rebellion followed by some more. That's right. And the reason why this is important is for several reasons, but I'll just point out a few. One of which is to not necessarily be a killjoy and take away their fun and just try to make life that much more miserable for them. It's to give them an ever-increasing sense of parameter of what your right and left limits are. hey, if you couldn't see it already, let me make it a little bit more distinguishable for you so that they understand that the Lord intends to march them toward life and to prevent them from being able to turn to the right or the left if they will just simply be faithful and mind the wisdom that is part of His Torah or instruction. So anyway, I'm going to curtail some of the reading that I had here, but I'm going to at least read the first 5 verses. So we get back to some stuff that sounds very familiar, and we might ask ourselves the question, why in the world is the Lord going back to talking about offerings again? They're not in a place for them to be offering offerings, we might think. But let's pay attention to the text. Verse 1. The Lord instructed Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and tell them, when you enter the land I'm giving you to settle in." What just happened in chapter 14, though? 12 spies, 10 that said we can't do it. God kills them, and for the rest of everybody else out there, we are only told that 2 of those men are going to get to go into the land, and everybody else 20 years of age and older are all going to die. A whole generation wiped out. Exile. The idea and prospect of the land has been kicked down the road like a can for 4 whole decades. There's no prospect of entering in the land anytime soon. But for God to begin the next little bit of revelation with, when you enter the land, gives us what? And a promise. Exactly. God is not writing them off. Now, it's kind of important for us to familiarize ourselves too, again, with a little bit more of the chronology. So this is Numbers 33. I'm not going to read that to you. It might be a little bit difficult to see, but the only thing I would really want to point out here on the TV screen is the fact that it says in verse 1, these are the stages of the Israelites' journey when they left Egypt, and then it breaks it down to them going to the Red Sea, then the wilderness of Sin, and then from there, they eventually make it to Sinai, okay? Then we have a list of all of these stops until we get to Kadesh. Kadesh Barnea was the spot where the rebellion of chapters 13 and 14 happened. Then no more cities are listed until they pick up stakes and start the process of going from Kadesh Barnea, which is right around the southern tip of the land here, all the way over to the eastern side of the Jordan River, where Joshua is going to take them into the land. So most scholars seem to think that there may have been some movement that occurred, but more than likely, this part of the journey started somewhere around the 38th or 39th year of their exile wandering, and for the first year of them undergoing this exile, up until that time, they may have spent the entire time here at Kadesh Barnea and never moved. We don't have any evidence that they did. So that's important because when we consider the idea of when God gave them this, it was somewhere during that 38, 39-year corridor. Is it possible He gave this legislation to them at the end, preparing the next generation for when they're going to go into the land? Maybe. It's probably a little bit more likely that He gave this to them much earlier than that, maybe even right after the exile outside of Canaan begins. Either way, it's important for us to kind of grasp that maybe they're not just aimlessly wandering all throughout the wilderness. So this section has 7 laws in it, and really there's only one that's new, but nonetheless, they are given a little bit more instruction about offering the minha. The minha, or in Hebrew mincha, is the grain offering, and the nesek is the drink offering. Now, we've already seen in multiple texts spread throughout Exodus and Leviticus mention of grain offering. In fact, in the 2nd chapter of Leviticus, we have a whole breakdown of just the grain offering itself and how it's to be given and eaten and all that stuff. But in every one of these instances where God says this animal is to be given for this reason, and it's to have its appropriate accompanying minha, or grain offering, and nesek, drink offering, no specifics are given anywhere as to how much is supposed to be given, with the exception of a handful of instances. Here, God is giving them explicit instruction on how much is supposed to be given. Let me read that for you. Verse 3, and you make a food offering to the Lord from the herd of your flock, either a burnt offering or a sacrifice, to fulfill a vow or as a free will offering at your appointed festivals, to produce a pleasing aroma for the Lord. All of this is invoking chapters 1 through 7 of Leviticus. The one presenting his offering to the Lord is also to present a minha, grain offering, of 2 quarts of fine flour mixed with a quart of oil. Prepare a quart of wine as a drink offering or nesek with the burnt offering or sacrifice of each lamb. So we're just given specifics. That's all that's really happening here. So that way they know exactly how much is expected anytime a grain or minhah offering is to be given or a nesek. From that, we go down to offering a cake from the ground meal. That's a new one because here they're speaking, or God is speaking about when you enter the land and you eat from the produce of the land. When I say produce, I'm not talking about fruits. I'm really talking about more or less the things that you glean from the ground, namely wheat, barley, spelt, those kinds of things. The first batch of dough is to be offered to the Lord. You give a portion of that to Him as a way of thanking Him for an abundant harvest season. When you enter the land, this is not to be observed regularly. There is a total separate offering for that. That is the time of Shavuot, or the Feast of Ingathering, what we call Pentecost. This is a one-time done thing. So again, like Nathan was saying, it's an anchor point. God is casting the vision of hope for them. When you enter the land, I'm going to get you across there. And not only that, but you're going to have the chance at some point to be experiencing enough peace to be able to actually harvest grain. And when you do and grind it up to make bread, you give me the first portion of that as a way of thanking me. Then he cuts back to unintentional communal sin or unintentional individual sin. Now, we've already seen how that gets accorded with the purification offering, because with all of these are unintentional sins that are committed, and a person who is guilty of an unintentional sin but made aware of this sin of unwittingness or ignorance, there is prescriptions for how and what you are to bring depending upon who we're talking about. A priest, a leader, the whole community, or maybe just an individual commoner. And there's a difference there with all the animals involved. But again, it's the emphasis on unintentional sin. And we'll get to a reason why here in just a second. Then there's the penalty for high-handed sin. High-handed sin means I am willfully, defiantly rebelling in this moment against God and the commandment. God says, if a person commits a sin of high-handedness and they blaspheme the name of the Lord, the concept of blasphemy is quite simple. It doesn't have to be anything specific. All that it has to be is just a willful action or word that is spoken as being disrespectful toward the Lord. So here in this chapter, we are given an example of a guy who on the Sabbath is out picking up sticks. The people remand him, bring him to Moses. They said, we caught this guy picking up sticks. What is he doing on the Sabbath he's not supposed to be doing? Working. The Sabbath is supposed to be kept what? Holy. That means it belongs to who? So to do something on God's day when He says do not do it would be an act of what against God? Exactly. Defiance and blasphemy by virtue of that. But even though the prescription has already been given, they seek to inquire of the Lord, and by virtue of that, death. God gives the prescriptive remedy again, and the whole entire community are responsible now for condemning this guy and putting him to death. So maybe a question would be, why the reiteration of these laws? Again, we've kind of covered some of this, but about number 3 down in the middle of the screen, notice the emphasis here on the olah, or burnt offerings, and the shalem, the fellowship offerings. These become the mainstays of Israel's offerings. In fact, you'll see spread out all the way through the books of Samuel, through Kings and whatnot, even in both high and low moments, there are fellowship and burnt offerings being given together simultaneously. And what is the reason for that? The burnt offering is the expression of the part of the worshiper to want to ascend unto the presence of Yahweh, to be in His presence, through the vicarious sacrificial substitute and the atonement of this animal that's going to cover them to be able to ascend unto the Lord's presence. And to fellowship, hey God, we want you to dine with us. We want to be in your presence and share a meal like Moses, Aaron, and the elders got to on Sinai when you were there meeting with them, breaking bread and dining with them and whatnot. And again, a redressal of the remedy for sin, intentional versus unintentional, because we're just coming off the heels of what happened at Kadesh Barnea. What happened there? The people committed a sin of high-handedness, and that was instigated by 10 men who said, God is not going to hold up to His end of the bargain, and God put them to death for their sin of high-handedness. We've already covered the example there. Let's go down to the tassels for your garments, because after this man commits this crime, God then says, you are now supposed to put a tassel on the end of your garment as a visual reminder to you of my law, so that every time you look at the corners of your garments and you see this solitary blue cord with the knots wrapped around it, you will remember that you are bound by them as those knots are bound up together to be obedient to me as a holy and peculiar people. If me speaking it to you is not enough, then I'll give you something that you have to see multiple times a day, so that, as he says, you will not prostitute your hearts after the things that you lust after, meaning you're still acting like Adam and Eve in the garden. You are still chasing after wisdom that you think is better than what I'm offering you, and it's not. And if you don't stop, hopefully you will understand from the examples that I've given already, it's going to lead to death multiple times over. All right, so then number 16, I have a large chapter or section to read, so I'm going to skip on that just for the sake, really, of telling you what's going on here on this slide. But we have, yet again, another 2-chapter snippet here of rebellion that is now being incited by a Levite, and he leads 250 men in this debacle that eventually spreads, again, like cancer, to all the rest of the community, and everybody starts to rebel. So what happens here, and just looking at the first few verses of chapter 16, Korah, son of Izhar, son of Kohath, a son of Levi, with Dathan and Abiram, sons of Eliab, and one son of Peleth, sons of Reuben, took 250 prominent Israelite men who were leaders of the community and representatives in the assembly. They rebelled against Moses. They came together against Moses and Aaron and told them, "You've gone too far. Everyone in the whole community is holy, and the Lord is among them. So why then do you exalt yourselves above the Lord's assembly?" So ultimately, Moses is being rejected as the deliverer. And we see this by virtue of the statements that follow on after this. Moses goes on to demand of them, okay, if you want to settle this, you and the other 250 are going to all bring fire pans, and you are all going to offer incense before the Lord tomorrow with Aaron, and we will see who the Lord chooses. And he will make it uncertain in everybody's viewing who the Lord has called to approach and come near him. Then Korah goes up to say, no, we're not going to come. And this is the reason why. He says, it's not, now notice the way he puts this. Is it not enough that you brought us up from a land flowing with milk and honey? Where did Moses bring them from? What is Egypt? The land of, I've been saying it all night, the land of what? It's not milk and honey, it's death. But what is Korah saying it is? Korah is saying, you brought us up from a land that was flowing with milk and honey. But as it's been described to them, what is really the land flowing with milk and honey? It's this. It's where they are going. So again, it's the inversion of the paradigm where Israel is going to constantly see Egypt as the promised land and want to go back to that and see what God is offering them as being, as they termed the manna. Our soul is wasting away because of this manna that you give us every day from heaven. So it's a perversion of what's actually happened. And he said, you did not bring us up to a land flowing with milk and honey. So he is basically calling out the fact Moses has failed in every way. Then Aaron is rejected as God's anointed priest. Moses says, hey, Korah, you're a Levite. God has separated you from the community to bring you near to himself. He has brought you near. You have been installed as a Levite to handle sacred things. And what's even worse than that, he's a Kohathite, which means he is part of the Levitical clan that gets to touch holy objects, meaning they get to carry the ark, the table with the bread, the lampstand. Nobody else outside of priests in the entire million-plus strong community gets to touch these things. That's their sacred job. They're coming as close as anybody can, other than priests, to these symbols, icons that bear the presence of God's actual, bear the touch of God's presence amongst them. But that's not enough. He says, you are pursuing the priesthood as well. So after this conflagration's over with, Moses speaks up and he says, God's going to do something new today. You will know that God sent me if the ground opens up and swallows all of you and your possessions whole. And guess what happens? Big earthquake, 250 men and their tents, everything they own, all get swallowed up. They go down to Sheol alive. God doesn't kill them there on the earth's surface. And then, after that, a plague starts to break out amongst the people. And we'll get to that here in just a second. But what we're supposed to see with this is that Moses' role is becoming a little bit more distinguished. Up until this point, Moses has been a mediator as much as he has been a prophet. Meaning not only has he spoken God's word to God's people, but in just about every sense that it's been required, whether it's because the people have sinned and somebody has got to stand in the gap between God and the people so that God does not destroy them, which has been Moses, or the people were terrified of God. In this instance, we go back to Sinai. Exodus chapter 20, after God falls down on the mountaintop in fire and smoke, and the people are terrified of the sight alone, then God begins to speak in thunderous roar. You will have no other gods before me. And as he continues to bellow out, the people come tugging on Moses. You go and talk to God. If he continues to speak to us, we're all going to what? We're all going to die. Moses is appointed a mediator between them and the people. Well, as this story goes on, something rather bizarre is going to happen, because it's not just these 250 men. Everybody then comes out and they start accusing Moses and Aaron. And by virtue of that, God has another one of these Exodus 32, Numbers 13 moments. I want to wipe them all out. So he begins to send plague out, and people are dropping like flies. And Moses acts and tells Aaron, quickly, go fill your censer full of incense and coals from the altar and run out in front of the people. And as a wave of death is coursing through the camp, he makes it ahead of the line of death. And right there at that moment, the plague stops. And Aaron is literally standing between the camp of the living that were just about to be swallowed by the plague and the camp of the dead. And this man, as it's said in the text, makes atonement for them. That does not mean he ran away really quick and killed an animal, shed its blood, and then their sins are wiped away or forgiven. No, he's standing in the gap to stop the curse and sting of death, makes atonement for the people. A beautiful symbol of what Messiah will do. What Moses has done on Mount Sinai when he said, if you won't blot their forgiveness out, then blot me out of your book. So Aaron, as God's consecrated anointed one, because in this whole storyline, he is really the only one who is considered an anointed one. He's the new Adam figure, serving at the summit of God's holy mountain, the one who gets to go into the innermost sanctum and dwell in God's new Eden space in his presence, is the one who makes atonement for the people and stops death. So that's important, because through all of this, what we're seeing is when Moses says, and he is now actually bringing a sign like Egypt, when he tells Pharaoh, okay, you don't want to let the people go? Tomorrow, gnats everywhere. And guess what happens? Gnats everywhere. And now that you've said you have relented, when I speak to the Lord and the gnats go away, you will know that the Lord is God over Israel and over the whole earth. So now he says to these people, here's how you'll know. Here's how you'll know that I'm the one that God has chosen. When he opens the ground underneath your feet and it swallows you whole, there will be no doubt in your mind. And it happens. Before he's even done speaking the words, it happens. So he's vindicated, reaffirmed as the right leader of the people. And then in chapter 17, very short, we have Aaron, along with all these other tribes, submit their rod, stick, with their names etched in on it, in front of the Lord. The next morning, Aaron is the only one who has budded almond blossoms. Yet again, another picture of resurrection, is it not? Dead stick, budding life, after the consecrated anointed one just stopped the sting of death. I mean, the gospel's written all over this. But aside from that, it's just the simple fact that we're seeing God vindicate his anointed man, or men in this case, for the sake of showing the people, look, I in my wisdom have chosen the right path for you, and yours is to follow. Stop seeking the wisdom that you want. Seek the wisdom I provide. And then, lastly, Numbers 18 is kind of a recapitulation of some stuff we've already seen. But in Numbers 18, God is breaking it down for Aaron. He is speaking directly to him, and he is saying, look, you and your sons are 100% liable and culpable for everything that happens in sacred space. He uses the very terms that he spoke to Adam in Genesis 2 when he planted him in the garden. And Adam is supposed to guard, or I should say work, abad, and guard, watch, or keep, shamar, the garden space. The same words are being given to Aaron as they were in Numbers 3. Aaron, you and your sons are to abad, work, shamar, guard the sacred space. and everything that happens here. And Aaron, it's not all on you. I have given you the Levites. They are a special gift from me to you to help you with everything here. Now, why do you think he is reminding Aaron that he is responsible for everything that happens here? Well, in the previous chapter, Korah tried to come near. He tried to take this privilege away from Aaron. He tried to declare himself as being just as holy and consecrated as Aaron is. So therefore, hey, we're all priests. We all should have the right to go in and offer like you do. And God is saying, Aaron, if you let people who are not authorized come near this space, I will unequivocally put them to death. And guess who was responsible for that? Because it's your job to teach the people what is the difference between holy and unholy, between clean and unclean. And then he goes on to talk to them about how all the offerings that come from the people are given to him. Now, notice this. Here we have a guy who is the consecrated Adam figure who is being given all the contributions that are dedicated to the Lord. If you, as an Israelite, want to bring a whole bull as a free will offering and sacrifice that to the Lord, guess who gets the shoulder, the prized portion of the meat from that, aside from the fat that's the best? Guess who gets the prized shoulder? Aaron. Whenever we all go and harvest our olives to make oil, our grapes to make wine, our wheat to make grain that we're going to use to make bread, we have to bring the best and the first, the tenth of our offering to the Lord. When I bring that to God, I don't pour out the drink offering in front of Him. Guess who gets the new wine? Guess who gets the olive oil? Guess who gets the sheaves of wheat? It all goes to Aaron. He gets the fruit and abundance of all that this land has to offer. What does that sound like? It's Adam back in the context of Genesis 2, in sacred space. You have all these trees to eat from them. This is your food. This is your space. So we're seeing, again, a picture of man imaging God. And then real briefly, here in Numbers 19, what we have here is this rather odd thing with this thing called the Water of Purification. So the way it's supposed to break down, basically, is the succeeding high priest, meaning the guy who is the son of the current high priest, is going to be the one to see this thing through. He and someone else is going to go outside the camp after the whole community has given over a red heifer cow that has never been yoked, and it has to be tamim, blemishless, that means whole, no sign of visible defect or unhealthiness or less than wholeness. Then outside the camp, it's killed. It's not sacrificed in the temple, tabernacle, nowhere on sacred space. It's outside the camp. Outside the camp is chaos and death. That's the way this visual imagery is set up. Its blood is spilt. A portion of it is taken by the priest to go back before the tent of meeting, sprinkle it there because of the idea of purification, because the idea here is that's what this is supposed to accomplish. Then the entire animal is burnt to ash. Then a person who is ceremonially clean, not tainted by death, has to come and scoop up the ashes, put them in a clean vessel, then find some clean place outside the camp and store them there. Then they have to make up a jar of water with these ashes mixed in it. Here's the reason why. Because anybody that has been tainted by death, that's what I have there under the unclean person. If you were in your house and your mother and father that you're taking care of are living with you because they're advanced in age, your father suddenly dies in the middle of the night, you wake up the next day, you realize he's dead, guess what has happened to everybody who's still alive in the house that was there that night? You're unclean. And you have to be unclean for 7 days. Now, why 7 days? It goes back to the creation narrative. From chaos to complete order by the end of the picture. You've been tainted by death. Guess what happens? On the summit of God's mountain, you're down here now, ritually unclean. You have to get back here. So that's the whole rebirth cycle of creation all over again in the 7-day period. And you are sprinkled on the 3rd day and the 7th day. And the idea behind this is it's the paradox of taking death and through death making one alive again by virtue of you being restored from unclean back to clean. Now, so a clean person has to come and they have to take hyssop, dip it into the water, sprinkle everything in the whole house. Your dad just died, you get sprinkled, your wife gets sprinkled, all your kids get sprinkled, the bed he was dead on gets sprinkled, everything in the room he died in gets sprinkled. Why is that? Everything's been tainted with death. Everything has to be clean. Without that, you cannot abide in the midst of God's holy encampment, which is everything. So now you're fit for the outside. The only way to be brought back in is through the process of the judgment of death itself somehow purifying you. And notice it's said in the context, if you were to go back and read this later on, this is a sin offering, but it's wholly different. By holy, I mean W-H-O-L-E-Y, or maybe it's L-O-Y, I don't know, sorry. Wholly different than the sin offering that's expounded to us in Leviticus chapter 4. When you sin unintentionally and you either have to bring a bull or a ram or a female lamb or goat, and then it's killed on the altar. This is not killed on an altar. Blood is either taken inside the tent or splattered on the altar. No blood is taken anywhere around those areas. It's all outside the tent of meeting. And again, the word that we get in English in the Old Testament for sin, kata, in these ceremonial cultic contexts also doubles as the idea of purification. So it's a sin offering, but it purifies. How does that happen? Well, it's part of the paradox that we've been explaining all along. But this is important. Why do you think this is important for us to be given this legislation now? Again, it's easy to see this as a hodgepodge of, so that's kind of cool when you get down into the weeds on some of the nerdier aspects of it, but why now? Why couldn't you have stuck this somewhere else, like way back in Leviticus? That seems like it would have made better sense there. What just happened in the 2-chapter valley we just talked about here? Korah rebelled, 250 men got swallowed alive. The whole entire community gets spun up in this. A plague starts sweeping through the people. When Aaron stops the plague by making atonement, then when the carnage is all said and done, 14,700 dead corpses laying on the ground. How do you get rid of that? You've got to find some way of disposing of the dead, which means people are going to have to touch dead bodies. And it's going to be days, maybe weeks worth of work to get all of these people buried and whatever you're going to do to dispose of their remains. So for all those people who had to lend a hand in helping dispose of the dead, what are they now? You're talking about a significant portion of the camp. How do these people then get back into right relationship with God, fellowshipping inside the camp, free of the tainting of death on them? This is yet again another act of God speaking wisely and graciously by giving them this allowance to say, you are unclean, but I will make you clean. That's part of the reason why it's given. So, any questions or comments on any of this stuff? Nothing at all? Surely I feel like I've said something that needs